Good afternoon, Lynette Oxley here for Tax Shack Tactical TV. Today we are with Ricky Mann. He has submitted a 137-page document. His comments on the proposed changes to the Firearms Control Act. Ricky, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Cool, thanks very much for having me, Lynette.
Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm 32 years old, born and bred in Johannesburg. Proud firearm owner and member of Tax Shack and GOSA. I finished up school in 2006, went straight through to Wits University. I did a Bachelor of Commerce in Business Finance and Economic Science. I then stuck around, I did a Bachelor of Economic Science with honours, and then I did a Master's in Economic Science. After I finished studying, my first job was with the Department of Economic Development as an economist, and I worked for an agency called the Competition Commission. So that was very interesting. It kind of exposed me to government policy, policy making, enforcement of government policy, and kind of some of the mechanics behind, let's say, government thinking. After my 5 years at the Commission, I have moved on. I've been at a private consulting firm for the past 3.5 years. So I'm doing the same sort of thing, which is basically applied microeconomics. But instead of working on behalf of government, I'm working on behalf of private clients. I'm also a guest lecturer at the Mandela Institute School of Law at the University of Witwatersrand. And so just collectively, I think my experience and my background is that my focus is on data and let's say data analytics, particularly with a focus on economics. But the line of work that I'm involved in, there's a lot of cross-pollination with the law. Because a lot of the work that we do and we prepare ultimately goes through to the court and is tested before either tribunals, high courts. I've done work in other jurisdictions as well, in the UK, before the European Commission, and throughout the rest of Africa. So I've picked up a lot about law and structured legal analysis, and I'm also married to a lawyer. So
that's interesting. And by the way, for the viewers, fantastic. He shoots really, really good. So it's very interesting to see the other side. I always just see you on the range, so it's nice to see the other side.
A little bit of a nerd when it comes to these things.
You don't look like a nerd on the shooting range. No, not at all. Any case, you submitted this 137-page document. It's single space, small font. It's a hell of a body of work. What inspired you to do that?
Sure. So it's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer for it because it might sound a bit crazy, but I have a real passion for science and for the scientific method. And part of that entails empirical analysis or data analysis from the real world to try and test hypotheses and claims that people might make. So that is coupled with my other passion, which is sort of for political science. And that's tied to my passion for firearms. It all kind of comes together. And this was, I think, an opportunity for me to explore outside of work, in my own personal capacity, the things that I was very passionate about and to apply some of the things that I know. So I think that's kind of like the high level nutshell answer. But I think maybe there are some other important reasons. When I take a look at the landscape of firearm owners today, there are a large number of courageous groups fighting the good fight against these amendments and just in general on behalf of firearm owners. GOSA, of course, being the major one, and many other associations. But I saw, I would say, somewhat of a gap in some of the work that's being done. A lot of the analysis that's coming out of let's call it the anti-gun lobby, which includes a variety of different groups, which we'll discuss later, a lot of it seems to be aimed at more technical-minded people. And the problem is that those conclusions tend to get picked up by the minister and they sound very persuasive and very sweet. And so they kind of make their way into the decision maker's mind. I haven't really seen a significant body of work that has challenged those research reports. And given my background, I thought, again, this is a good opportunity to actually directly address that. And then I think probably a third reason is hopefully, as I've said before, I can't be the only econometrician or statistician that's also a firearm owner. I'm sure there are other passionate people out there. And hopefully, this is some inspiration or at least a catalyst to get others involved and to address and to attack the same issues, which is this kind of underlying research data body of work which seems to be misleading on the face of it, but is it really misleading? And so, at least in part of my report, I spent at least 40 to 45 pages just interrogating 5 of these major research papers, but there are many more, and I think that's the next step.
Because ultimately it comes down to it's a political fight.
Yeah.
And what the politicians do is ultimately influencing what we have our rights in terms of firearms.
Yes, yeah.
So that's where it all ends up in the end.
Yes, yeah.
Why do you say the proposed changes to the Firearms Control Act is materially flawed?
Okay.
What in a nutshell, can you try and do it in a nutshell?
Okay, sure. The Firearms Control Act is a piece of administrative power. And all administrative power is subject to, I would say, to review or subject to certain threshold tests. And these tests are put in place to safeguard our constitutional rights from an abuse of that administrative power. So there are 2 threshold tests that I looked at. And the reason I segmented them into 2, some people may say they are one test or there are different aspects to this. But it was, I segmented it into 2 because it's a neat way to segment the evidence supporting each of these tests. But of course, you could look at them maybe as one test or slice and dice it in many different ways. So the first test deals with arbitrary power. Now, a piece of policy or legislation would be arbitrary if, when viewed objectively, there's no connection between the means and the ends, or at least the objectives that are sought by that policy. So let me give you a useful but strange example. If we wanted to reduce motor deaths on the road, and I decided to put together some policy which said people are only allowed to own 5 chickens, you can clearly see there's no connection between the ownership of chickens and reducing deaths on the road. So that's an extreme example, but that's sort of where the test is going. And this is known as the rationality test. So if there's no objective connection, then the piece of policy would be deemed to be irrational. And it would be deemed to be irrational because it's arbitrary, so there's no connection. Now, arbitrariness undermines one of the fundamental constitutional principles of the rule of law. So if there's no rational connection, the policy would be arbitrary, and that would undermine the constitutional foundations. And so on that basis alone, the policy should be dismissed. So that's the one, it's an abuse of of administrative power that I looked at. Now, the main piece of evidence supporting that abuse is the socio-economic impact assessment, which we can get onto just now.
Absolutely.
It's been picked apart by others, but I think I can maybe add a few extra additional points and critiques on that, which could be helpful. The second abuse is an unjustified limitation of our constitutional rights, as per Section 36 of the Constitution. So like I say, you might include the rationality test in that, but I've separated it.
So what does Section 36 say?
So Section 36 says our rights are not absolute, and we accept that that is part of our law and part of any constitutional, let's say, regime. Our rights are not absolute and they can be limited, but they should only be limited under certain circumstances. And if they are limited, then the decision makers, or at least the administrators who are actually putting this piece of legislation together, need to justify that. Now, this justification is slightly different to the rationality test. This is rather called a reasonableness test. And the reason it's called a reasonableness test is because, again, there may be reasons as to why the limitations make sense. This is a much stricter test than the rationality test, so it requires a more careful balancing and reading of the evidence. But what's helpful about this is that the Constitution in Section 36 and through other case law tells us what are the relevant criteria to determine whether the limitation is justified. So I looked at some of these things, and I think we can summarize them as follows. The one issue is, what are the costs and benefits of the policy? Obviously, if the costs outweigh the benefits, it's not justifiable. Part of that is thinking about, will the policy actually achieve the objective? So going back to our little chicken example,
motor vehicle example,
the number of chickens you own, even if that policy was implemented, would have no impact
Absolutely.
on road debt. So you're not going to achieve it anyway, and therefore the policy just becomes a wasteful, costly piece of legislation. And I think the third important thing is whether there are less intrusive ways to achieve the stated objective. So again, we can think about, just common sayings like, you're not going to use a sledgehammer to smack a nail, right? You can use a hammer. The reason is that the sledgehammer probably is quite costly. And if you miss the nail with a sledgehammer, you're going to damage what's around it. So, using over-intrusive policy to try and achieve a stated objective should be avoided because that is unreasonable. So the reasonableness test, you can see, requires a little bit more thinking, a little bit more evidence and a greater analysis. So for that, I considered things like the socio-economic impact assessment, still relevant. Yeah. But here, the Ministry of Police report from 2015, 2016 was very important. Public comments made by the minister might be an indication of why the amendments could be justified, or other comments by other anti-gun organisations. All of these things are relevant pieces of evidence. The Wits report, very useful.
Very useful, which was hidden from public for a very long time for specific reasons.
Exactly. I think it's it can't just be a strange coincidence that a year later the ministry report came out, which references and cherry picks pieces of the Wits analysis and ignores the main conclusions, which is that policing is the primary, and like we say, so this is important because a less intrusive way to reduce crime is to improve policing.
So they're trying to use a sledgehammer for a problem that doesn't need the sledgehammer.
It doesn't need the sledgehammer. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So if I could just say that if the Control Act, if the amendments don't pass the rationality test, that should be the end of the story.
Yeah.
If it does, it's then subject to the reasonableness test. And if it doesn't pass the reasonableness test, then essentially you have a piece of unconstitutional legislation.
Okay.
And therefore, on that basis, the FCA and the evidence on which the FCA is based on is materially flawed and should be discarded, or at the very least should be redrafted after further extensive consultation with firearm owners who were not consulted, and we know that as well.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads to another very important point, which I also did put in probably one of the first pages of my report, which is why are public comments so important? Ministers are not exposed to the same problems that we are. Not that they're not subject to crime, but we're subject to different levels of crime.
And they've got VIP protection,
which
makes a massive difference.
Exactly.
Big difference.
So public comments are crucial, and so I think if this process is to continue, absent comments from firearm owners, it would be severely flawed.
Absolutely, and that's I think where GHOST is also going with this campaign that they have, We the People, because we the people are pretty important in terms of what decisions gets made.
Yeah. So that's also consistent with the reasonableness test, right? So the reasonableness test in full says, can these limitations be justified in an open and democratic society? Because, of course, they could be justified in a tyrannical society. Absolutely. But we don't live in a tyrannical society. We're trying to safeguard our democracy. So it needs to be justifiable in an open and democratic society. And I actually think that the extensive comments that are going through to the minister is indicative of working and functioning democratic society. And so the minister should stick within that framework.
There was an amazing number of comments. It was it was huge.
What was the total number? Close to 200,000 somewhere.
It was around that figure.
Yeah, I think when I looked at the DRSA site, I may be mistaken, but I think the number of comments even on the amendment to the Constitution regarding expropriation without compensation was only about 15,000.
So this is important.
This is big,
This was big.
Yeah.
I think GHOST has got a lot to do with it. We are trying to get out there and see that that we don't that our firearm rights, our rights to life, doesn't get taken away from us.
Sure.
Okay, we've mentioned the socioeconomic impact study. What is the rationale behind it, and how did it influence the proposed amendments?
Sure. So the socioeconomic impact assessment is actually quite an interesting. It's a very interesting read because I think it's the foundation of the amendments. There's some debate here, and I've seen others maybe have a different interpretation to me. The socioeconomic impact assessment, I think, is dated 2015 or 2016. Yeah. Some people have said that that is the date at which the economic assessment was, the impact assessment was drafted. I'm not sure if that is the case. I don't know if we've heard back from the Secretary if that is the case. But in my view, that date actually reflects a socioeconomic impact assessment framework. So that's the date of the framework or the template on which the socioeconomic impact assessment is based. And that framework is actually drafted by the Department of, I think, Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. Now, if you read that framework, it's actually quite good. And if the drafters of the amendments had actually stuck to the framework, then I think the amendments would be much better, and they would probably be more in favor of firearm owners, because they should have stuck to a framework which would have taken into account whether the amendments will achieve their stated objective, what are the costs, what are the unintended consequences. This is the big thing about policy, which we can discuss later, we've got some time, but a key issue in modern policy analysis is not just what are the direct costs, but what are the unforeseen costs, because as you say, if you're smashing a nail with a sledgehammer, you're going to damage everything around it. Stripping firearm owners of their rights to own firearms may actually increase crime. How are we going to deal with that?
But that is what the Wits report basically said. It had no influence. Stronger policing is
what we need.
What we need, and we're not getting that at this stage. I'm going to actually talk to Paul a bit later today, and about the forum, the what do you call it, the amnesty and the amnesty guns that's now coming out.
Yes.
That's been given over to criminals. So stronger policing is obviously the answer, more than trying to take away firearms from legal firearm owners, which has gone through all of the hoops to get their firearms.
And I mean, and we can even get onto some of the data which will support that. But just before we get there, just moving on to the just sticking on the framework.
So what was the framework in broad? Can you summarize that for me?
So the framework in broad is, so the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation sort of developed this framework, and it says, going forward, when other departments plan policy and legislation, they should use this framework as a guide when they actually do this. And like I say, the framework is a useful guide because it tells the drafters what they should be thinking about when they draft the legislation. But if you look at the SEIAS, it seems as if the drafters ignored some of the unintended consequences. They ignored whether the act will actually work.
Personal political agendas, that's the only reasons. Okay.
The drafter's name is on the document. He's part of the legal unit at SAPS. I can't pass comment on his credentials or the quality of his work personally. I do not know this person, but it seems as if the SEIAS was rushed and it was done hastily without proper investigation. And the assessment of the data doesn't seem to support what the SEIAS says it supports. So that's actually the first thing, is that the state has already developed a framework, but the SEIAS is inconsistent with the state's own framework. That's already a big thing, right? But if we ignore that and we give the state the benefit of the doubt and say, assuming it is consistent, let's look at the actual merits of the SEIAS. Now, I think a key issue here, which arises in both the socioeconomic impact assessment and later on when we think about the reasonableness test, is that it's a common logical error to confuse correlation with causation. Now, I know that Paratus, I think that's Gideon, had discussed this, but I think here I was able to build on this just given my experience in the data analytics, because this is a common problem, and economists and policy analysts encounter this problem very frequently, and there are more advanced statistical methods to address it, but it appears that the minister and the secretary have ignored this. So I'll give you a quick example.
Why do you think they ignored it?
Okay, I think we know.
Because they had, again, we get back to the political agenda. They had an outcome that they wanted, and they tried to get backing for it, but they didn't get backing for it. So they just went ahead in any case.
Yeah. So I think we could probably put that down to a flaw known as confirmation bias. So this is, based on my reading of the philosophy of science, this is where how science has sort of evolved over time. For a large part of our history, scientists try to design experiments to confirm their conclusions. As now more modern scientific methods design experiments to try and falsify their conclusions. We're trying to prove things wrong because it's very easy to find evidence which will confirm what you want to see. Because as a researcher, you're going to be biased to trying to find solutions which support your agenda. And they shouldn't have been doing that. They should have been critiquing and analyzing academic research which supported their conclusions instead of simply agreeing with it and putting it in their reports. But to go back to this correlation-causation issue, because it's crucial to establish causation when you look at policy. So I've got this little example in my paper, but I'll try and explain it because I think it's easy for even the layman to understand. Let's assume you want to try and understand whether there's a relationship between children's shoe sizes and their academic knowledge. Now what you'll probably find is that kids with bigger shoes are smarter. Now, can we conclude that wearing big shoes makes you intelligent? No. There's a third factor here, which is age. Okay, what's obviously driving both of these things, both shoe size and intelligence, is age. Because when you get older, your shoe size increases, but when you get older, you also going to be smarter. Right? A 16-year-old kid is smarter than a 5-year-old kid. What are the implications of this for policy analysis? Let's assume a well-meaning, well-intentioned politician said, we need to improve children's education. Yeah. And he sees that there's this correlation between shoe size and children's intelligence. So he says, right, let's give kids bigger shoes. You can see that just by giving a child bigger shoes, he's not going to become any smarter. Now, in fact, what you've actually done is taken children and given them shoes which are too big, which probably cost more money. The government's probably going to spend money trying to subsidize children having bigger shoes. And at the end of the day, these kids are not going to be any smarter. There's correlation, but there's no causation. So from a policy perspective, you are misdirecting your policy at the wrong thing. There are probably other ways to improve children's education. What might happen is that children wearing bigger shoe sizes might be smarter because of luck, by chance. Maybe in 1 year, there was a sale on small shoes, and all these parents bought small shoes for their kids, and so they were very uncomfortable in class, and they didn't learn that well. So the government, actually, by giving kids slightly bigger shoes, maybe they become more comfortable in class, and they learn more, and they do improve their shoe knowledge. But again, that's just purely by chance. The question then would be is, should they then give the children even bigger shoes? But we know there's no causal relation there, so even bigger shoes still won't make a difference. And the reason that that's relevant for the amendments...
That's where that was going to be my new question. So put it in
context of the amendments. So the reason that this is important is because the SEIAS provides no indication that the amendments will cause either a reduction in crime, a reduction in gender-based violence, a reduction in suicide. None of these social ills, which are apparently related to gun ownership, are caused by gun ownership, right? So if there's no causal relation there, there's no reason to expect that there's a rational connection between the amendments and the objectives. And that's already the first test. When I viewed objectively, there's no connection between the means and the ends, because there's no causal relation. The amendments are not going to achieve the objectives that they seek to achieve. And so on that basis alone, I think the SEIS and other justifications already have a problem. But if I can relate it even more clearly, when you look at, for example, let's say you're trying to determine, like, for example, homicides and gun ownership, and you think, okay, right, boom, we've got this piece of legislation that's going to intervene, and it's going to reduce gun ownership, and that's going to reduce homicide. There's lots of other things that cause homicide.
If you look at the Wits report, blunt objects and knives and stuff, it's huge. It's huge. Yeah. It's a huge proportion of that.
And choice of weapon is another major issue here. So the firearm, so the amendments might restrict firearm ownership, but criminals may just simply choose to use other weapons, etc. So there are many different other causal factors at play here, and the SEIAS has failed to take those into account in quite spectacular fashion.
Absolutely.
Another source of a bias, so we would call this in the econometric literature, you would say these are biased, would be something known as reverse causality bias. So it's not that gun ownership affects crime, but crime affects gun ownership. It goes the other way. So again, it's not clear that by reducing gun ownership, you're going to resolve crime. In fact, if it works the other way, taking guns away, crime will just continue to be exerted on people who now no longer own guns. And then on the final point, the issue here might be, let's assume, and we can get into the research later, let's assume, so I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt here, that the Firearms Control Act of 2004 did actually reduce crime. As I say, the Wits report already says it's not the case, and I also, in my assessment of these papers, also find that any conclusion in that regard is likely to be misleading. Let's assume that it did sort of work. Does that mean we should have more amendments? Okay, so this goes back to my shoe example.
Yeah.
Maybe giving kids slightly bigger shoes may have helped. But does that mean now I should give a 5-year-old a size 20 shoe? Maybe giving him from a 4 to a 5 may have made him more comfortable and improved his learning, but it doesn't mean that successively larger shoes are going to make a difference. So maybe there was, it's unlikely, but if the Firearms Control Act in 2000 did make a difference, it doesn't mean now that more amendments will make an even bigger difference. Yeah. In fact, if you've reached that optimal level of legislation, once you go over that, you're starting to use a sledgehammer. It's going to start going the other way.
Absolutely. How did Minister Celi and his team justify the limitations of these rights?
So that, I think, sort of the SEIAS and that assessment, and again, if you read the report, I go into even more detail about other failures of the SEIAS, but that kind of deals with the rationality part. The next part is this reasonableness part. Now, the reasonableness test was quite difficult, because normally what would happen in legal proceedings, for example, I think good examples recently would be the case against the minister regarding the regulations about smoking. Yeah, so that went to court. The minister lost that case, but it is on appeal. But here, in court processes, there's people draft affidavits, there's an exchange of documents, people set out their arguments very clearly. Right now, the amendments are still at a very early stage, so we don't know. The minister hasn't, let's say, prepared a document which says, these are my justifications. So I kind of had to go and look for some of these justifications. Now, one might say, oh, okay, but Ricky, you're going to straw man these arguments. In other words, you're going to set up a weak argument by the minister and then knock it down. I tried my absolute hardest to avoid that. In fact, I tried to, there's another expression, you can steel man arguments, right? I tried to make the minister's arguments as potent as possible and then could see if I could knock them down. So I looked at a few documents. The SEIAS, as I say, there were public comments. The FCA is also very instructive, right? The preamble has been changed, and that, we can get onto that, but that's very important.
That is probably the thing that actually worried me the most.
Yes.
It was the preamble. Of all of the changes that worried me.
Yeah, so the preamble has been changed, I think, in a way that is at least internally consistent. So the amendments are consistent with the new preamble, but they're not externally consistent with the real world. We can get into that. But you can look at, so if you look at the preamble, it might tell you a little bit more about what, so if the preamble says, we're amending this act because we want to improve public safety, well then public safety is a potential justification. So yes, and then there was the Ministry of Police report, okay, which I think, was very long-winded, and like I say, it suffered from various problems like confirmation bias. It failed to interrogate the underlying evidence, and probably one of my biggest critiques of it is it's not as much a justification as it is a simple listing of reasons. Okay, the reasonableness test is not just about listing a reason, it's about whether that reason is justifiable and proportional, which is another legal aspect, but in an open and democratic society. And the Ministry of Police report doesn't do that. But it's understandable because those documents are not prepared for court. So I presume that if this was to go to court, they would probably use those justifications, but would beef them up a little bit. So I think the three main justifications that they use, if I could summarize them, is one, safety, and there's kind of a private and a public safety element to it. The next thing is there's sort of social goals, right? So economic growth, economic inclusion, social cohesion, all of these sorts of things. And then there's, and safety also deals with gender-based violence, right? That's also another important issue, which I understand is at the top of government's mind, and obviously everybody's trying to solve that. And then the third thing is our international obligations. So either international law, foreign law, or international law norms. So the bulk of my report sort of focuses on this reasonableness test because there's a lot of evidence to assess. And there's a lot of ways to assess whether the minister has justified this. So let me maybe get into two of them. You don't have time to go through all of them. The first one I can talk about is public safety. Okay, so we need to distinguish between private and public safety. Owning a firearm for private safety is if I'm a victim of crime.
Yeah.
Public safety deals with if I have a firearm of mine that is stolen or I lose it and it gets used by a criminal and then that criminal uses that to commit crime against a third person.
So that's a very big thing from Gun Free South Africa.
Yeah.
That's,
okay.
Yeah.
This is a big thing. So let me.
If your gun was there and you were there, that whole thing.
This whole thing. Okay. So there's lots to say about this, but I'll try to go through it sequentially. The first thing is, personally, I find Gun Free South Africa's argument to be somewhat morally depraved. It is just simply not. There's just simply no basis to look at somebody who's been a victim of crime and then victimize them further.
Absolutely.
You know, if a lady is a victim of a sexual offense and she's a law-abiding citizen and she's done everything within her powers to be a law-abiding citizen and she is a victim of crime, I could not personally go to sleep at night knowing that I'm going to point a finger at this lady and say, you are also now as bad as a criminal. I can't see it.
No, absolutely.
But, Gun Free South Africa can make whatever claims they want. That's maybe a bit of a soft issue. Let's get into the data here. So public safety is about lost and stolen guns. So there's two things to note. Firstly, I think we should differentiate between lost and stolen guns. Lost guns are guns lost due to negligence, and I think that lost guns due to negligence is an issue which needs to be addressed.
Absolutely, I agree with you.
And firearm owners that lose their guns should be punished. If you are a law-abiding citizen and your firearm is stolen,
obviously,
this is incidental and unfortunate, and we need to think about ways to address it.
But it's not your fault.
It's not your fault.
No.
And personally, I can't see how it's reasonable to say, let's address this issue by just simply stripping people of their rights to own guns for self-defense. And again, this is a sledgehammer and a nail. The other issue we need to think about is if there are legal firearms that are moving from legal firearm owners into the pool of illegal firearm owners, how many of those firearms are being recovered? How many of those firearms are coming from alternative sources, either from SAPS, which Paul will deal with later?
Yeah, because that's a big...
it's a big issue.
It's a very big issue.
Yeah. It could come from the SANDF. It could come from smuggling.
Outside of the country.
It could come from smuggling. Now, I think Gun Free South Africa and others have argued that the amount of guns that are moving from legal to illegal from police, SANDF, and from smuggling is probably quite slim. And it's slimmer than what's coming from private firearm owners, but I'm going to address that explicitly in a moment. But regardless of that, the point is that the key issue here is the current proportions are actually irrelevant. Okay, why is that? Because even if the majority of firearms are at the moment coming from legal firearm owners, if the amendment takes all the guns away from firearm owners, criminals will just get them from somewhere else.
Absolutely.
So you can't look at what proportions look like now. You have to think about what will the proportions look like after the amendments. Okay, so the second point I wanted to raise is that in addition to the fact that criminals will likely find firearms from alternative sources, even if private citizens no longer possess those firearms, is that when we think about this pool of illegal guns, we also need to think about how many guns are being recovered. Okay, so this is what my research uncovered is that it was slightly different to the Wits report. The Wits report actually suggested that quite a small proportion of lost and stolen firearms are recovered. But if you look at SAP's annual reports, you can actually see the number of firearm details that have been circulated for stolen and lost firearms and how many have been recovered. And actually that recovery portion is quite high. So I think those are kind of the overarching sort of issues which we need to think about. And if we then get into the data and we apply this to the data, what I've done is I've tried to address two key questions. The first one is, are firearm owners irresponsible? Okay, so this was kind of a question that I think Anthony Altbecker tried to answer in 1999 and 2000. Lots has changed in the past 22 years. But, I think it is a valid question and one which needs to be addressed. So there's two things we can compare. One, let's take a look at how many guns, new guns are registered every year, or licenses are registered and approved every year. And let's compare that to the number of lost firearms. Okay. After we account for how many firearms have been recovered and or how many firearms have been destroyed by the state. So let's be generous and say, let's assume that a lot of those firearms that were supposed to be destroyed, found their way back into...
That's why I'm laughing, because
yeah.
a lot of them are actually finding the supposedly destroyed, but they're not.
But they're not. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say, actually, quite a lot of those guns do find their way back into criminals. If you compare those two numbers, I think the proportion of lost and stolen firearms every year compared to newly registered firearms is 3 or 4%.
Minute.
It's minute.
Yeah.
If we only look at lost firearms, because remember I said we need to distinguish between stolen and lost firearms.
I think Paul always makes that point. You don't blame the victims.
You can't blame these victims. Now, the proportion of lost to stolen firearms has changed every year, but the estimate, I've got 4 sources, and that estimate ranges between 4 and 25%. So if we are conservative when we give it the highest number of 25%, well then the proportion of lost guns as a proportion of newly registered guns every year is 1%. If we compare that number on a yearly basis to the total number of firearms, we're probably sitting at roughly, at least if I look at data from 2014-15, because that's where I have the most consistent range of data, you're now looking at a few thousand guns at most which are lost or stolen compared to 3 million guns. It's minute. If it's only lost guns, it's even smaller. It's less than 1%. So the data doesn't suggest that firearm owners are significantly irresponsible. Question 1. So the second major point is whether these guns which have been lost or stolen contribute significantly to the pool of illegal guns. So you can imagine if that pool is only 2,000 guns and we lose 1,000 guns or 1,000 guns are stolen, even though it's small relative to total firearms, legal firearms, it could be very big relative to illegal firearms. So this is a bit of a tricky one because we can't be sure of the total number of illegal firearms, but the best estimate that we have at the moment based on the available data is about, in 2017 it was about 2 to 2.1 million illegal firearms.
Sure, that's
which is a huge amount. Now, we can obviously get into the history of where these firearms come from, etc., etc. But one thing we know for sure is that if we only lose a few thousand firearms, relative to the total number of illegal guns, it's tiny.
And it's not going to make any difference.
It's not going to make a difference. We can also look at this over, instead of it on an annual basis, but over time. So the Wits report does quite a good job of calculating the total number of lost and stolen guns from 2000 to 2014. But again, if you look at private citizens, right, so not the state, not the SANDF, not other institutions.
Not
security. And again, we go back to our original idea here, which is we need to take into account how many guns are recovered, how many of them were lost versus how many of them were stolen. On my conservative estimate, giving the benefit of the doubt again to the Secretary and to the Minister, is that we've probably only had about 135,000 lost and stolen firearms from private citizens. Again, 135,000 over 2.1 million over a period of 15 years is just not that big.
No, it's not.
But there's a fundamental problem with all of these calculations, which is once a firearm is lost or stolen, unless SAPS gets their act together, there's no way of us determining how often and how frequently that gun is used to commit crime. My gun could be stolen and tomorrow it could be exported through the black market to Mozambique. My firearm could be stolen and used 20 times a day. It could be used never. Now, there are potentially ways and means of uncovering this data, but it would require more work from the ballistics, from SAPS, because every time a firearm is stolen, it should be linked to all the various different crimes in which it's been committed. But we just don't know that.
And I think what the Wits report looked at is that the reporting from the SAP side is not good.
Yeah.
We don't know, even with when they do autopsies and stuff, they don't really go into detail. We don't know if crimes were committed with legal firearms or illegal firearms, and it doesn't go into more detail.
Yes. So this is, I mean, you've touched on a key issue here. This is a fundamental problem with all of the academic research is that it fails to distinguish between legal and illegal firearms. So you look at all these homicides and you just think this is a legal gun problem. But if most of those homicides were as a result of illegal guns, then again, even if you curb legal firearm ownership, the number of homicides is not going to decline that much. And if we go back to our reasonableness test, if the decline in firearm homicides is very low, but you've severely impacted on firearm owners' rights, that is not proportional. There's a severe impact on rights with very little benefit. The stated benefit won't be achieved, or it will be achieved in a very small way relative to the infringement. So the test hasn't been met. But okay, so you hit on a very good point there. So we can't determine that number. So the issue about justifying public safety is already going to be quite challenging because we don't have a lot of data in that regard. Unlike in America, right? In the States, they've got tons of good data. But ultimately, the data we do have available is not very persuasive. The justification doesn't seem reasonable. The second issue I want to touch on, I'll try to be a bit quicker on this one, is the international obligations. To me, in my mind, this is a very interesting one, but it's also very worrying. The reason is that it appears the amendments desire to elevate our international obligations ahead of our own domestic constitutional rights.
I agree with you 100%.
And if we go down that path, firstly, I think the state as a whole is going to be stuck in the mud here, because on so many occasions the South African government has absolutely ignored our international obligations. And certainly the former president of Sudan rings a bell, where he arrived in the country and should have been arrested under our obligations to the ICC and was allowed to leave.
Yes.
We consistently ignore best practice policy economically, because there's a belief in South Africa, as our previous president Mbeki said, we need African solutions to African problems. Okay, so why are we so intent on meeting our international obligations? That's a principal issue. But let's get into the actual international obligations here. If you read all of these international obligations, and there's a lot of them, if you read them, the primary motivation underlying these international laws is to curb illegal and illicit firearm trade. Now, if the amendments are directed at curbing legal firearm ownership, it's absolutely unclear how implementing measures to restrict legal firearm ownership is going to meet our international obligations, which seek to restrict illegal firearm trade. You could make the argument that legal guns find their way into illegal the pool of illegal guns, but we've just discussed that. The data shows that the proportion of guns that shift from legal to illegal firearm owners is negligent, and criminals can still get their firearms from many other sources.
This report actually mentioned the digital printing of firearms. That's another one.
Which is another one.
So,
all of these issues seem to have been ignored. But so that's the one thing, is that just purely an assessment of the international obligations shows that the FCA will not meet those obligations because they are directed at two very different sources. One, illegal guns, which is very difficult to manage, and the other, illegal guns. So it seems as if the Secretary and the Minister have said, we can't solve illegal guns, let's go for the legal gun owners. Notwithstanding that, their amendments are unlikely to solve the problem. So, and then if I could say, finish us off here, the last issue is, again, I think it's always good to give your opponent the benefit of the doubt. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt here and say, okay, let's look at these not the international laws, but international norms. Right? So I'm not talking about the UN obligations. Here I'm saying, let's assume that stricter firearm ownership works, because it's worked in Australia, it's worked in Japan, it's worked in the UK. A, it's questionable about whether it's worked. But B, there's a much more important issue here, which is Australia, Japan, and the UK comparable to South Africa? No. So at least in my report, I tried to do some de novo, like a fresh analysis. And I said, what are some of the key drivers of crime, right? So where can I look? Well, let's use what the police say. Let's use what the government says. Crime is a function not only of rational decision-making, so criminals, after money, after drugs. It's also a function of our socio-economic environment. Now, our socio-economic environments are vastly different to Japan, the UK, and Australia.
Absolutely.
We differ in terms of GPP per capita, in other words, our average income per person. We differ on ease of doing business. We differ on the state of our police force. We differ politically. We have different histories. We have different levels of inequality. And all of those things drive crime. So it's unclear to me how using their laws is going to help South Africa. If I can use a very simple example here, I see this in my work quite frequently. There are some provisions in the Competition Act which try to curb something known as excessive pricing. So in other words, if you try to set your prices too high, the law should try and take care of you. But what is an excessive price? How do you know whether a price is excessive? So one argument is to use an international benchmark. So if price of apples here are 50 Rand, but they're only 1 Rand in Australia, that's quite big. We're using Australia as a benchmark. But in order to use another country as a benchmark, you have to understand whether that country is comparable to South Africa. To go back to our apples example, what happens if in Australia it doesn't cost you a lot of money to farm apples, but in South Africa it does? If the cost of farming apples in South Africa is much higher, well, farmers have to recover their costs, so it's normal for them to charge more. So if you're just looking at price, you're missing the underlying story about whether these countries are comparable. So the same thing is with regards here to the amendments. If our country is vastly different to other countries, then why should we expect their laws to work in South Africa?
Absolutely.
So I think that sort of takes care of the international obligations. I think, let me stop there because I could talk through the whole report.
Okay, Ricky, so which data-related techniques are commonly used by the anti-gun lobby and the government in its supporting documents, and why does this not work? So that's my first part.
Okay.
Please also refer to your critique on the 5 research papers,
Okay.
if we can just touch on that as
Sure.
well.
I think first let's unpack this notion of the anti-gun lobby.
Yes.
Okay, and sort of maybe this will give some further motivation as to why I structured my paper the way that I did. The anti-gun lobby sort of has 3 components, and we'll start from the bottom and we'll work our way up. At the bottom are these academic researchers. Okay, so
Yes.
this is going to be, if you read the authors, Matsopoulos,
Yes.
Matthews, Abrahams, Jukes, etc. The majority of these researchers come either from the Medical Research Council, or the University of Cape Town,
All
or
in
UNISA.
that area, if you look at
Yeah.
the sort of the Cape Flats.
Yeah. It's, I understand the motivation for their research. I don't have any doubt that it's not well intentioned, but there's a problem with it, which we'll get into later. There's lots of problems with it, but I think just at a high level, a lot of people in medical research and doctors, there's 2 things. Firstly, they're not policy analysts. Okay, when you're writing a research paper where you're trying to understand the relationship between stricter firearm control and homicides, doctors see the homicides.
They say they see the bad end.
They see the bad end. They are the guys who have to work 36-hour shifts, who probably are not getting paid properly, especially if they're working for state hospitals. They're under-resourced, they are underpaid, they're overworked. But they're not policy analysts. They see one side, and I think that their motivation is to say, well, how can we reduce the pain that we see on a daily basis? I don't think that it is nefarious in any way, or that they have a political
agenda. Especially from the Children's
agenda.
Hospital and stuff like that, which comes out with the anti-gun lobby quite a lot.
Yeah. So actually,
the Red Cross Hospital, I think.
Yes, so there was a paper, I think that was Campbell 2013, where they used data from the Red Cross Hospital, which I'll try to get onto in a moment. So yeah, I think that the intentions are good, but they're not policy analysts. So they're not always thinking about the things that we should be thinking about, which is the bigger picture. Even if they can show that stricter firearm regulation did result in fewer homicides, they're not thinking about what are the costs of the legislation, what happens if it doesn't work, what are the unintended consequences of it, what rights are being limited. They're not thinking in terms of rationality and reasonableness. They're not thinking in terms of justification. They are trying to test their hypothesis using whatever data is available. And to be quite frank, a lot of their data sets are somewhat incomplete. So that's sort of the one That's the one group. And like I say, I don't think they have any bad intentions. That research then filters into the next group on the pyramid, which is the mid-level tier, which are the kind of anti-gun organizations, which will be Gun Free South Africa, the Institute of Security Studies, there's a National Prevention Crime Unit, etc. Now, this is where things do get a little bit more tricky. It doesn't appear to me that Gun Free South Africa does their own research. They collate and repackage the academic research. That's why I say the academic research is at the base. They repackage that. The ISS, which is the Institute of Security Studies, they do some of their own research. It's de novo, it's a fresh sort of research. But they are not as anti-gun, I think, as Gun Free South Africa. It is very explicit. Our ISS is probably a little bit more balanced, but I still think there are problems with their research. We can try and touch on that just now. So they repackage all of this stuff. Now there's probably some scope to argue that this is not well-intentioned. The reality, whether we like it or not, is that research doesn't happen in a vacuum. Researchers, even though I said those researchers at the base are probably not, don't have bad intentions, you still, need to get funding. You need to get grants. For example, the 2012 and 2013 papers by, I think, Abrahams and Matthews received funding from the Open Society. Now,
so
which is George Soros' organization, which no longer provides funding for Gun Free South Africa, but it's common cause that the Open Society is not pro-firearm.
Absolutely.
Now, you can say in your paper, as they say, that the funding had no effect on the design of this research, but no man is an island, right? You're getting money from somewhere. It's very unlikely you'll get funding from them again if you're going to come up with a conclusion which is completely against the underlying philosophy. So it's not that you will lie, cheat and steal, but researchers might be persuaded to try and, it's not that they lie, but they may not tell the full truth, or they might
massage
the figures, not even the figures, but you massage the conclusions and the recommendations that you draw from the data. So there's the researchers, you've got Gun Free South Africa, and then you've got on top, you've got sort of the minister and the Ministry of Police. Now, this I find quite interesting because the minister should have access to an immense amount of data. They should be able to gather information on all different types of homicides, different ways that crime is committed using different weapons. You should be able to segment that by demographics, all these kinds of things. They have access to CFR. But I think, as we know and as the Wits report showed, is that a lot of the police data is unreliable.
And there's still issues. I've done reports at police stations just filling in forms, and there's problems with them capturing the stuff. There's just general problems.
Yeah. So there's problems with, the best way to describe it is the accuracy of the data is not quite there. But the point is that the minister it doesn't appear to me that the minister conducts a lot of their own research. They either outsource it, so as they did with the Wits report, or they rely on other third parties, either from institutions like Gun Free South Africa or the ISS, and then those guys get their information from this research, which comes out of the Medical Research Council, University of Cape Town, etc.
And they refer to each other as well, which doesn't, it's not good science.
Yeah, so it's, I'll try my best to explain this. It's not necessarily bad science, but they do it in a misleading way. Lots of researchers will refer to their peers and will refer to themselves, but then that research has to be credible. The problem that these guys face is that they will say, yes, our research is credible because it's gone into a journal which is peer-reviewed. But the problem is if your peers think the same as you and they write with you and you've all published together and you all refer to each other, then the credibility of the journal is actually under threat. So in a normal setting, I'd say referring to previous work that you've done that's been tested and gone through multiple checking processes and has been critiqued and is in the public sphere and has now become commonly accepted knowledge, I would say that is okay. But when you continuously refer to your own research and your pal's research, who's also judge, jury and executioner on your research because they may be an editor of a journal, the waters become a bit muddied. So I think, that is maybe an additional motivation for my paper, which is if we can address the foundational evidence upon which the Minister and Gun Free South Africa rely on, if that evidence is shown to be flawed, then the conclusions and recommendations flowing from that evidence is going to be flawed. There is another twist to this, if I could put it this way, which is even if that evidence is not flawed, the conclusions and recommendations themselves can also be flawed. Now, this happens quite frequently in research, and it happens because researchers are going to be biased. They want to find an answer to their question.
Yeah, and maybe they've already decided what the answer is and they're trying to get the two together.
Maybe a statistical term for this would be called data mining. So in other words, instead of starting out with a theoretical proposition and then testing it using the data, you go to the data and you let the data dictate to you what the theory should be. And in fact, there's a specific methodology which one of the authors used, which is called a backwards stepwise regression, where they build their model not based on sound theory, but instead they use the data to dictate how they should build the model. Now, it's commonly accepted that this is actually a very dangerous approach. And the reason for that is, in simple terms, when you start doing all these tests on the data, they are not independent of one another. And so when you build that model by doing all these different types of tests on the basis of the data alone instead of theory, the confidence that you can have in your conclusions becomes much weaker. Now, I think that was the 2008 paper by Matthews. They note this, which I commend them for noting it up front, but they do not mention that this could be misleading, which I think is another issue with some of these papers, where they haven't really fully addressed some of the assumptions and underlying model building methodologies explicitly. They just, again, they're not doing bad research by ignoring it. They're telling you what they're doing, but good researchers would say this is a problem because of this, and we try to mitigate the risk by doing X, Y, and Z. And they don't do that. So I think that's the motivation, right? You've got these three levels, and attacking, I think the foundation is good. But as I say, back to my original point, which is even if the evidence is good, the conclusions and the recommendations can be bad. So to give you an example, you might find that, kind of go back to our shoe example, right? You might find that stricter firearm regulation did reduce the number of homicides, but it may have only reduced the number of homicides in Cape Town. Does that mean that it's applicable to all of South Africa? Well, maybe not. Cape Town's special, right? There's lots of gang violence there. That's just, maybe a quick example, which is that researchers often draw conclusions which exceed the scope of their data, and they shouldn't. Right? If I only have data about motor vehicle accidents on the N1 highway, I need to motivate why I can draw conclusions about motor vehicle accidents in Durban. I'm talking about the N1 in Johannesburg, right? So you need to, researchers, even if their data is good, the conclusions and recommendations they draw from it should still be tested.
I think there was this one incident which Gun Free South Africa uses, which was in a very small area, and the researcher said it's only this small area, and they've actually extrapolated it to South Africa.
To South Africa,
which is not great, and that's what you're saying.
So I think the researchers, so that bottom tier of the pyramid, are probably less guilty of this data crime. But unfortunately, I think Gun Free South Africa in particular like to read a research paper and pick out the one conclusion which sounds like you've got the icing on top of the cake, and that's what they'll run with. The minister does the same thing in the Ministry of Police report. And that's been probably my biggest critique of the Ministry of Police report, which is that those researchers fail to interrogate their supporting sources. Good researchers, you can't interrogate everything, some papers may have 100 references, you may not be able to read them. I read references, and then I read the references of those references. I tried my best where I had time. But you need to accept that there may be flaws within the underlying research, and you have to note them. And I think, that's definitely where the Ministry of Police went wrong.
They failed.
Yeah, they failed there. So let me get into the data techniques. So I think in sum, let's go again back to this issue of causality, because it's crucial for policy analysis. So what we're trying to do, and I think there's again good research to support this, is that modern policy research attempts to find causal relations. It is not of relevance to find mere association, because as I said, if you're a policy decision maker and you decide to go on policy based on association, your policy decisions are likely to be bad for people. They're likely to be harmful and have costs, etc., etc. So the data techniques that we should be using in order to determine whether policy has been effective in the past should be along those lines. Researchers should try and show that stricter firearm regulation has caused a reduction in homicide, not that it is associated with a reduction in homicide, because of course there could be a third factor that is reducing homicides, which is either related or unrelated to the stricter firearm regulation. So I think this was a key issue in the Matsopoulos paper from 2014. It's definitely important in the Matthews papers, and because there's 2012 and 2013, and Abrahams, and then the Matthews paper from 2008. So let me go through two basic data techniques that they use, and I'll feed in some examples from the papers. So the first data technique, which is quite common, is known as a before and after technique. At its simplest level, what it does is you measure a problem at a point in time, you then apply some sort of intervention, and you then measure the problem after the intervention. Now, that could be a way to attribute cause to the intervention. Okay, so again, let's think of a simple example. This is very common in the medical literature. You're going to try and test whether a medication works. So you measure a patient, you give him medication, you measure him afterwards. Did the medication work? This is a very the benefit of this is that it's very simple to understand, because it's just comparing a statistic now and a statistic down the line, and it's very easy to get data. You literally just need a time series. Okay, so data of a variable over time, so before and after. The problem with this is that there could obviously be many other interventions during that period which are not related to the intervention you're trying to measure. So firearm ownership is a good idea here, where you say, well, in Abrahams they say, what was the female homicide rate, femicide, in 1999, and what was it like in 2009, and you see it came down. They then say, well, during that period there was stricter firearm regulation, therefore stricter firearm regulation had an impact. It may or may not have had an impact, because in 10 years there's many other things that may have changed which would have affected the likelihood of a female homicide.
And that's also, the Wits report also says the whole FIFA World Cup, where there was stricter policing, etc., etc., had an influence, and they didn't take that into consideration.
Exactly. So, and I think that is, so that is the main problem with the before and after, which is that in maybe technical terms, you can't control, this is a word which is commonly used in regression analysis, which is a second technique, is that basic before and after analysis does not control for other intervening factors which may influence the outcome. Okay, so Abrahams does this in the 2012 paper, which is through the Medical Research Council and Open Society, and then they do another paper in 2013 which takes the same paper and just sort of beefs it up a little bit, right? Because what they add to it is a second technique known as regression analysis. So regression analysis can be quite complex, but the benefit of it is that it's very flexible, and it takes us a step closer to causality. And why does it do that? Like I was saying earlier, one of the issues with trying to isolate a cause is that there could be many other factors involved.
You don't know what's what.
Regression analysis can help you take care of that. So you can now, instead of just thinking about a before and after, you can think about before and after given a whole lot of other things which also may have impacted the outcome.
Is that what the Wits report did? More regression, or because they looked at all of the other factors that was playing?
So you can look at all these other factors outside of regression analysis.
Okay.
But the regression analysis is a very powerful technique, because mathematically it can account for these things, and it can give you a little bit more certainty when it comes to cause. Okay, so imagine if we go back to our shoe example with the kids. We were saying that shoe size influences the children's intellectual levels, but there was age, which was the third variable affecting both of them. If we were to put that into a regression, and without including age, we would find that there's this relationship. But once we include age in the model, that relationship will disappear, because it's actually age that's driving all of this stuff, not shoe size. So regression analysis will, if done correctly, will tell you that. The problem with regression analysis is it requires richer data, so you need more data instead of just the simple time series before and after. You now need data on all the other factors. And it also requires a number of assumptions which need to be made. And if those assumptions don't hold, then you can't be sure of your conclusions. They might be misleading. Now, what I found when reading a lot of the research papers is that only really the Matsopoulos paper, I would say, did a good job of actually trying to account for some of these other factors. There's still problems with that paper, but it was definitely the best of all of them. So, for example, in the Abrahams paper in 2013, when they do this regression analysis, they only include one variable in their model. Now, the problem is that is very similar to the before and after, because you haven't taken into account all these other potential causal factors which might be influencing the outcome. So we can't really be confident in their results. The Matsopoulos paper does go a step further, and it tries to incorporate other causal factors like age, day of the week, etc., etc. But that problem is also flawed. That paper is also flawed. Now, I think I'll try to be as simple as I can on it, but I think probably the two or three of the main problems there is, the first thing is, when we're trying to isolate cause, we have to be quite sure of when that cause started and when it ended. Okay, so for example, if we believe that the FCA only started in 2004 instead of 2000, which is what Matsopoulos argues, then the chances are that you're likely going to attribute more of the work that was actually being done to the FCA, because you thought it started earlier. So you thought it started in 2001, and you see these homicides coming down, but actually if it started much later, it means there was something else.
2004.
There was something else that was coming down. And this is actually quite interesting about that paper, if I can digress momentarily, which is, when did the FCA 2000 really come into effect? The researchers all claim, again, I'll give them credit for being honest, they say it started in 2000 and it came into effect in 2004, but there were some aspects of it which were being implemented. But none of them tell me which aspects were being implemented. Because if the aspects that were being implemented were irrelevant, small, tiny little aspects, then yes, those aspects existed before 2004, but the real meat of the work was only being done in 2004, which means that Matsopoulos is likely to overestimate the number of lives that were saved by the FCA. That's the one problem with him, is that with his paper, is that there's no real way to identify, there's no real way to attribute cause to the FCA over his study period, because it's unclear about when the FCA came into effect in his study. So that's the one major issue with his paper. The other major issue with his paper is, again, he does a better job than his academic friends.
Yeah.
And that's related to the causal mechanism. So what he argues is that the data shows this decline in homicide, and he attributes it to the FCA, which we've already said is doubtful, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt, says that's the case. How did it actually work? How did this FCA actually impact? Well, he argues that it impacts because the FCA reduced the number of legal firearms, that reduced the number of thefts and losses, and that is what impacted on the homicide rate. But we've just spoken about this earlier, that if you actually look at the data, firstly, it's ambiguous as to whether the number of legally owned firearms declined from 2001 to 2004. Secondly, the number of lost and stolen firearms, if you actually look at the Wits report, is quite constant over that period. It's not like it suddenly decreased, like massively. It only decreased in the final period. But what's strange is that in that final period, the number of homicides actually went up. So his causal explanation for how the FCA actually worked is not quite there. And there's also a number of other assumptions which he uses which are also likely to be flawed. And just very quickly, what his problem is that he tries to calculate the number of saved lives by comparing the firearm homicide rate with the non-firearm homicide rate. Now, you can do that, but only under certain assumptions. And in particular, one of these assumptions is known as the parallel trends assumption, which sounds fancy, but what it really means is that if I want to calculate the number of lives lost, the number of lives saved, I need to estimate what would have happened if there was no FCA. And then I compare the two and I calculate the difference. Now he says, well, let's assume that this is the same as the non-firearm homicide rate. But it's questionable as to whether you can actually make that assumption. And I go into a little bit of detail about why that is the case. And if you actually think about that in the context of when the FCA was employed, which was fully in effect in 2004, what that means is if you use his own data, it actually shows you that the parallel trends assumption doesn't hold. He's using the wrong comparison group. Or at least, if we use his own data as an alternative comparison group to measure the number of lives saved, it actually shows that he overestimated the number of lives saved. So I think those are kind of two of the main techniques, before and after and regression analysis. But all of the research papers try to employ them but sort of come short. Now, what is the implication of this? The primary implication, and you see it in the papers, is that they haven't shown cause and they've exceeded the bounds of what their data tells them. And they start making inflated claims about the relevance of stricter firearm regulation. You can't look at a simple before and after and then just say, oh, this must be because of the FCA when you haven't shown cause. And then, worse, you then make a recommendation to implement stricter firearm regulations. You haven't shown cause, you haven't identified that stricter firearm regulation works, yet you are now here telling us that we should implement even stricter firearm regulation. Absolutely. So, like I say, there's kind of like this gradual progression of, is the data good? But even if the data is good, the conclusions and recommendations are inflated and exceed the data. That is, I think, a bit of a summary of sort of what I include. But obviously I've gone into a lot more detail. And I think that, kind of the next step is to think further about this in terms of other papers. Now, the reason I say that is because I know that Metsopoulos has recently published, I think in 2018 or 2019, something similar to what he did in 2014. But he has more data, okay, because now he's got this new data set, which I still believe is incomplete, and the Wits paper notes this, because it doesn't include rural data. In fact, I quote 3 different sources, even from Gunfree, even from his own research in 2000, 2001, where he says the current data set, which is the NIMSS data set, or NIMMS data set, that only covers 30 to 40% of the population.
So, Ricky, where to from now?
Okay. Sure. Okay, so I think the first point of departure is going to be for us to contact the researchers and get their underlying data. Now, let me explain why.
Do you think that they will give it to you?
They may or may not, but I believe that it's important, and there's a reason for this. In some of the research papers, the researchers have stated what statistical program they use to do their research. I'm very familiar with that program because I use it in my day-to-day work. It's a program called Stata or Starter. Now, the benefit of this program is, unlike, let's say, Excel, which is click and point, Stata also is click and point, but it can also use code. Now, the benefit of that is that you can save all of your code. And what you should be able to do is open up another researcher's code and click Run, and it should spit out the exact answers that they have. What it does is it takes the data set, it imports it into the program, it cleans that data, it does the analysis, and it gives you the results. So it's very important, for example, in my line of work, when we do data analysis and we submit it to an authority, the authority says to us, but how did you get to the answers? And we say, here's the raw data, here's my data coding, and you put them together, you click Run, and there's your answers that you see in the Word document that we submitted. It will also tell us if they did any additional, let's say, tests about their assumptions and sense checking the data and making sure that it all makes sense. That should, according to Stata themselves, in their workflow process manuals, suggest that all of this code should be saved because it allows you to track what you're doing and it allows for sense checking of other people's research. So that's the first stage. Let's get that, let's sense check it, let's make sure it's all there and that it lines up. After that, I believe that we can definitely expand on the scope of the research that we've looked at. I focused only up until 2014, 2015, because that's really where the WITS report, the Ministry report, etc., that's kind of, I think, the genesis of the FCA comes from there. So we can definitely go further and start looking at that. And then I think the next step is to take what we have and probably put it into, when I say probably because it might be tricky, put it into a digestible and easy to understand format and start getting more and more researchers involved in this field. And I think we can take inspiration from other jurisdictions, especially in America. You have many, many people in the pro-gun lobby that are doing these types of analyses. Now in South Africa, we don't always have that data, but there's absolutely no reason why there can't be why we can't do our own research or why we can't produce research based on others' research where we critique and we have open debate. I think that that is at least the best thing that we could do for now. And I guess we can always think long term about, as I say, presenting this to the minister, and instead of having Gun Free South Africa whispering in his ears, we can at least be whispering in the other ear to say, as a government body, you should be responsible to listen to all sides. And that's, I think, at least the starting point.
Well, thank you very much from the gun owner side for joining us and for doing this massive piece of work. And thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks for having me.